journey at the Freedom Park in Raleigh. It's a slave memorial located behind the Archives building, the State Archives building in downtown Raleigh. It's got a lot of quotes from different time periods of slavery and segregation, civil rights, different things like that. It was a decent experience. You know, you could definitely feel the aura of some of the quotes and things like that. It's a decent place. But the highlight of today was Stagville Plantation in Durham, North Carolina. We were fortunate enough to be able to secure a tour there, and upon telling them we were Jewish, they were allowed us to get the tour for no cost, because we are the Jews, of course, so it's not like we lied. But the plantation, when we first pulled in, there's a sign that has, you know, the information on it, the hours of operation, but there's this gravel path just cut through the woods. It's a gravel path. It's not cement or anything like that. And as you're driving down, you can feel the pressure of the fact that it's like you're leaving civilization and you're going into the past. It reminds me of the movie Antebellum. Yeah, that's the only way I can describe that pressure, that feeling like it's almost like we're arriving on the horse and carriage on the back of the slave transport, and you just pull straight up to the main house, which is facing that road. You know, it's facing that road. And, you know, you get there and it curves off to the right where they built this little visitor center and things like that. But the house is the main thing you see when you first come down that path. The house doesn't look like much. It doesn't look like a lot, you know. At this point in time when we're first coming in, we don't know a lot of information about it, but we do have a tour guide that's gonna you know, give us additional information and stuff like that. So one of the first points that he made that stuck out was the size of this plantation. Stagville Plantation at its peak was around 30,000 acres. And the tour guide told us that he made the claim that they always say, yeah, it's the plantation that's the size of San Francisco, which made me Google how long does it take to cross San Francisco in a vehicle. And it says from east to west, it takes about 20 to 30 minutes. Well, it made me realize that on the way to the plantation, we hit all of these windy roads and things like that. And for about 15 to 20 minutes, that's all you saw. It was just state roads, you know, not a lot of buildings and things like that. And I realized after seeing the map and understanding the size of it, we were still on plantation grounds at that moment. So from 15, 20 minutes out driving 55 miles per hour, we were already on the plantation and didn't even know it at that moment. So step back to pulling up to the actual house. You notice that it's on an incline. That was another point that the tour guide made, is that the house was set on a hill. Of course, that's to be able to see all of the plantation. You could see all around 360 degrees. What we encountered was trees and everything like that. And you could see the hill where it dropped off around the house. You could gradually see the terrain drop and everything. But what we encountered was trees and everything. But the tour guide let us know that all of that would have been flat plantation ground. It would have been fields. And 30,000 acres, you can't see from one side to the next of that. You can walk for 45 minutes and not be off of the plantation, not anywhere close to being off of it. It was set strategically in that location because there were Native American trade routes. The indigenous people of that area, Durham County area, they set their trade routes along the three rivers that are around the house, around that land. And they set them perpendicular to that. So when they needed to take the trade route to the river, they would hit the river, and then they would be able to take the boat down to the next trade route. So that's how they traded all the stuff. Well, of course, when colonial Edomites hit the area, they searched for things like that, strategic places and places where it would benefit them, and they stole the land. That's the tour guide didn't say it, but the moment you start mentioning indigenous peoples and routes and things that they use, they stole that land because it's now a part of the plantation. So he gave us the tour of the main house. We couldn't go inside, but it was, like I said, it wasn't much to look at, and he pointed out the fact that the reason the house wasn't much to look at was because they spent their show. Some people use their show of wealth in their main houses, right? The big, like, think of Candyland on Django or something like that. They used it to show their wealth in the house. This plantation owner, I believe they went by the name Cameron. I think that was Cameron. Their last name was Cameron. They used their plantation as their show of wealth. So the main house didn't really have to look like much, but when people would travel down the path, which is now a main state road, the road that I said was coming in, when they would travel down that path and slaves would be transported up and down those roads and things, going to various plantations and things like that, or coming to work there, they would see the lands, and that would be their show of wealth.
This plantation, the Stagville, they have a lot of history tied into it. So originally, we were supposed to go to the Mordecai plantation, 5,000 acres, right? Sounds big. And that was like almost a foundation for Raleigh. Right. Well, come to find out, this plantation was 30,000 acres. 30 freaking thousand acres.
The example they used was that it was the size of San Francisco.
Yeah, it was the size of San Francisco. That's how big this plantation was, and it pretty much was a city. And at the time, they didn't verify, but I'm gonna make sure I verify for y'all. At the time, Hillsborough, this was in like the late 1700s, 1760. Hillsborough was the capital of North Carolina at the time. Borders looked a little different, but they had made sure they plastered this plantation on 3 rivers. They had taverns and all this other stuff, and they had slaves that would pass by the plantation. They had more that were here, but they had slaves that would pass by the plantation. No more than 900 would pass by it daily. Daily, 900. So Durham we're gonna take our time with Durham.
It's all green, right?
Yeah, it's like hard. It's soft. Yeah, it's not used to seeds. Cameron was one of the guys who he wound up inheriting that slave plantation because it was split into 2. It was Benahin and Cameron, and then those 2 together, it came into 30,000 acres of slave land, about the size of San Francisco, like Ebnaya had mentioned earlier. But there was a couple key things about going up into Master's house. They had this mound of rocks, right? And it looked like it was all just gravel. And everybody, when I asked brothers when I came back after we came from there, I said, what y'all think this is? And then everybody said, oh, it's a gravesite. That was actually a 12-foot, I wouldn't say it is, 12 feet tall chimney made for just cooking. That was meant to be inside, which was once inside of a 2-story plantation house where the cook lived to be able to cook for Master, right? And then when you go further down, we had more imagery about that. They had some slave huts and different things like that. These were all things that was meant to be just for Master Cameron at the time, right? And the others, they had other slave masters, but Cameron is one of the ones that are focal points. So when we went there, we went down, and then they had nothing that I would say is no bigger than 300 square feet, maybe smaller. I'll say anything between 150 to 300 square feet. It's hard to remember exactly how much, but I know seeing it is about the size of a good sized office space, but it wasn't so fitting for something to live in. 11 people lived in it. 11 of us lived in it. One of the other things I noticed, when you looked off to the distance into where the housing was, like the house there had a distance where there was parking, and it was a ditch. That ditch was where they had the Indians, or the Indigenous, they called it Gad, Reuben, but primarily Gad. They used to use that area, but they mixed Gad, they mixed the Indigenous, they mixed the Indians with African American, and called them all niggers. They didn't say that, but I learned based off of the way that Esau talks what they mean when they say certain things. They called both Gadites and Judites niggers.
So the other part that really struck me as interesting about it was when he said they know that the routes that they used that ran parallel with the hill that we were on. He said it was Native American trade routes, and they knew that that was what it was, right? So you know some of these 30,000 acres was them killing the Northern Kingdom and taking their land.
Yep.
You know it was.
So, matter of fact, I'm glad you said that. There was a hill next to where we parked, and you're gonna see it on our playback.
Right.
But that hill is where the Gadites were, and they enslaved Judah and Gad together. Jeremiah 50:33.
Mm-hmm.
This plantation had us both there, but they called all of us niggas. They didn't call one another the same.
Right.
They didn't call us, say, this is Native American, this is this. They called us all niggas.
This plantation, huge, but the thing is, it was created to be that way. Now, the way the tour guide had mentioned it, and I had to meditate on this just a bit, he was like, 30,000 acres didn't just come when they got here, and then it just automatically 30,000 acres. It came over the process of time. I'm willing to believe that, actually, because it probably came and took a lot of the land, because it was taken. It wasn't like it was given to them. It was taken for sure, but over the process of time, they wound up growing it because it was two slave owners that owned most of that land. So it started off with Benahin. I'm still saying his name wrong. And then Cameron came in and it was married into it, right? So it was surrounded around three main rivers, and those rivers were named the Eno, the Flat, and the Little River. And where there were big rivers or rivers enough that was around there, it was surrounded around mills. There were mills that were there, meaning there were places to work. And well, there were places to work, meaning there were a lot of slaves that was walking around there. They mentioned that around 900 slaves they would see daily cross that plantation, because again, it's the size of San Francisco, the size of it. The thing is, when you're looking at this and you're saying us and you hear us talk about this size of this plantation, you're probably imagining, dang, they saw 30,000 acres worth of slave plantation. No, it's not the case. Raleigh, if any of y'all know it, has the RTP area, Research Triangle Park. Duke is in the mix for that. They have a lot of places. There's private companies who own a big portion of that 30,000 acres. There's only about 160 or so acres that you can actually see visibly of that historic site. The rest of it, the other portions of the site that you can't see, they built corporations on top of the bodies that now are buried. And there's another portion of that acreage that's about to get cut off based off of townhomes they're trying to set up on the other side of the plantation, which is what we're going to mention next.
Yeah, this used to be a giant cornfield, but over the process of time, the land and the trees moved over.
Officer was mentioning the foundation that was left there of a primitive slave home that was maybe 100 or so feet away, yards away from the main house, the brick house. This little area was, all you saw was a stone foundation. Like he said, it was only about, I think he said 7 to 11 people in that small area. It's literally no bigger than the area that we're in right now. I know you can't see, but it's literally no bigger than that. But 7 to 10 people in there, I couldn't even envision a floor plan of sleeping bags that would fit 7 to 10 people in that area. Some of our tabernacles tents are bigger than that area. But on the flip side, this is where he begins to speak of the family who lived in that house, in that home, and that was the Walker family. The Walker family was on the plantation for quite some time. They have records and stuff regarding that. There was a daughter of the Walker family who became the caretaker for one of the Cameron daughters. That daughter, the Cameron daughter, was very sickly, and they would take constant trips back and forth to a hospital. And at that area, at that hospital, there would be talks of abolition and things like that. And so 2 times the abolitionist would approach her while she's at the doctor's appointment with this young Edomite girl, and they were trying to convince her, hey, you know, you can get your slavery, you go a little bit further up north, all that good stuff, right? She denied it the first 2 times because she had 2 children that lived, and she would be leaving her children, her mother, her, you know, her family that lived in that house, she would be leaving them. Well, in that time frame, the Camerons purchased a cotton plantation in Alabama. From North Carolina to Alabama, they purchased a cotton plantation in Alabama, and they marched 119 families from Durham County, North Carolina to Alabama. I didn't say marched for no reason. On foot, they walked 119 families from Durham County to Alabama, the state Alabama, right? They claim they only lost 1 person. There's gotta be a lie. Of course there's gotta be a lie. But I said that to say the 3rd time the young Walker daughter got confronted by the abolitionists, she said, okay, and she bounced. She did, because there was no guarantee that her family would be stuck together at that point anyway, because they had just torn families apart to march some of them to Alabama to start this new cotton plantation that they had purchased. So with that, the Walker family and their primitive style of house that you see was some of the earlier slave quarters that were in that side of the plantation. Then we took a trip to the other side of the plantation, which was the agricultural side. That's where you would have had your slave quarters and things like that, and it was set in the midst of what the tour instructor said was a massive cornfield. When you pull up to these houses, you know, you see one white house that you may think was probably a slave master or the overseer's house. Then you see these I can only call them row houses. That's because that's literally what they look like. They look exactly like apartments that you see Black and Hispanics growing up in now in the projects. They were fully wood. They were 2-story. They were just big rectangles. They set up on foundations of rocks. They had wood windows that looked like they just swung open and things like that. One of them had an additional kitchen that had been built onto the side of it. And the reasoning that they set them up on those platforms was because one of the Camerons at that time, because this is generations of Camerons that are on this plantation. This is generations of Camerons. One of the Camerons, somebody mentioned to him that your doctor bill is going to be really, really high. These slaves are dirty, so you want to build platforms to keep them as high off the ground and from being in their own squalor. You know, we were property to them, so use words that, you would use for an animal, squalor. So they built them up on platforms. But the visual of these houses, if you go to McDougal Terrace in Durham right now, and imagine that same, what they look like, but fully wood, that's exactly what they were living in. They were sitting right next to each other.
The plantation, after a while, I want to say about that's what they said, the early 1900s is when the Cameron family wound up vacating the property, right? Now, they're still out there in Durham. One of the guys who actually, surprisingly enough, they actually went to the tour, knows the family that's out there in Durham still, and they down the street from their house. The person that was on the tour with us, down the street from his house is some descendants of the Cameron family living somewhere else, fat, rich, whatever the case is, right? Anyways, point that I'm making is the Leggett Myers Tobacco Company owned that property for a while as well, because smoking was very big in the United States for a nice little while. You had the Roaring 20s, the Great Depression during the 30s, 40s. They had the last portion of the World War II. The 50s, they had the baby boom was really getting up and going with the baby boom after the war. 60s, of course, they still smoking and doing all this other stuff. Anyways, point is, a tobacco company wound up owning the plantation of where we was once sold, right? So I thought that was interesting. Another thing, they had this man they called him Scrub. He was one of the first slaves. I'm going back in time now. They had this man by the name of Scrub, or his nickname, and he was the first slave that was at that plantation, but he successfully escaped. And they have documents. They gave us documents to look at to show how much each slave was worth. The women was worth more than the men, but he was worth a lot also because of the skill that he had on that plantation. He was Cameron's closest per se confidant in regards to slaves, but it's not like he confided in Scrub. It was just he was his first slave. But now when we get to driving down the road, and we go to the other plantation, McDougal Terrace was the project, and it did look exactly like that. I wound up making mention of that to the tour guide. I was like, I don't know if you ever been there, but this looks just like McDougal Terrace. It looks just like the projects. And then the tour guide had let me know, yeah, you see little semblances of this same kind of slavery, but in today's society, right? Funny thing is, when we was out there, we was doing the whole tour and whatnot, we was actually looking around, we wound up catching grave diggers out there. That was an interesting thing. On the plantation, they had this white house that, like Ibnai was making mention of. You would think it was a slave master's house. That was actually one of the families there called the Hart House. It was the Hart family. They're still alive today. They're still out there. They was on that plantation even after the Emancipation Proclamation, 1865, right? So people was expecting this big thing. Cameron, he was losing his mind about the fact that he was going to lose a lot of money. Remember, they had 3 rivers that it was surrounded around. There was mills all around. There was taverns. He had 30,000 acres full of slave land. Him and Vernon, right? 30,000 acres. So they made a lot of money. They made a lot of money with that. So now when they were hearing the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln, they were under the impression that they was going to lose a lot of money, but they didn't immediately let the slaves go. They said, you can be set free. It's how the contract came in. You can be set free, right? Thing is, remember, when we went to the state capitol and we went into Union Square, which is where it was at, they had on one of the places when we went inside of the Capitol how Abraham Lincoln, along with, I forget some of the other guys' names, but what hindered the process of what they should do with the slave men during that time was the fact that Abraham Lincoln, he got assassinated. Andrew Johnson wound up taking the place because he was vice president. And it was a big deliberation as to how they're going to fit into a constitution that wasn't originally made for slaves. That's what it was mentioned inside of the state capitol here in Raleigh. So then when you get over there to the Cameron slave plantation where we was at over there in Stagville, Durham, right? You have the Hart family. They were there all the way up from Emancipation, 1865, all the way to 1950s. They just left. 1950 wasn't that long ago. In the 50s, they just left They're still around. They have a colored photo of when the last time they was there and they had to leave. Then it became a historic site, but they were just there. And it reminds me, I'm from New Orleans. They have this project over there called the Iberville projects, right? Now that's a tourist attraction even in New Orleans. The same thing I'm seeing is happening here. They built up this whole thing during slavery. Family that literally just left not too long ago. We have mothers and grandparents that's older than that, still alive, and they use it now for a historic site. Now, they had a barn. It was over to the side, right? And the barn was built without nails. I thought this was interesting. They couldn't confirm it, but they said that they had slave boys staying there with the mules, right? And the mules apparently, well, point is, they said that a little boy stayed in there. They couldn't confirm it. I can confirm that that actually happened because they have other records. We brought it out. Those of y'all who are familiar with our content, Deuteronomy 28 project that we did before, they definitely had us sleeping inside of the same huts that they had their horses and mules and oxes, right? So, something I found interesting though was, and the tour guide couldn't confirm this, was not only that it wasn't built with nails, it was wood, it was dovetailed, almost similar to how the temple was built. So we built that and we dovetailed the wood on wood so that way it can stay up, and it's still good to this day. Same wood that was built with back then, it's huge and it's still brand new looking ish, right? But I found interesting that they couldn't confirm it. I can though, that they had slaves from the islands come up and help build the plantation and build the barn that they were already in on the Cameron Plantation or Stagville Plantation. And come to find out, one of the places that actually had slaves come to this colony, because it was one of the 13, right? That came to this colony, some of them came from Bermuda. Helped out over here, and then they had some from the other islands as well, but they had slaves that came over this way and established this colony. And at this time, during this time, it was debated what the capital of the state was, and it wasn't always Raleigh, it was Hillsborough, which at the time being 30,000 acres, size of San Francisco. We didn't drive through all of 30,000 acres. We had more land that we didn't even get to see that was the original size of this plantation. But it just shows you how big of an area we worked, slaved, and toiled like cattle. That's why we're bringing out this documentary. That's why we're trying to show you the truth behind where a lot of you live.